Going back to the last list of revolutions that I showed you, surely you will have read and noticed some of the most famous revolutions in history. But what do all of these have in common? Well, they were all successful, and as a consequence of their success, change took place. Let's look, for example, at the French and the American revolutions. In both cases, official documents were signed, the American Constitution and the Rights of Man and Citizen. Both of these documents are still valid today and are the basis of, respectively, the American laws and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Often, though, these changes evolve in something bigger and better, or maybe worse, and even once maybe the issue is solved, there still will be faults and loopholes in the system that will allow for these problems to leak, like rotten human liquids out of an exploded casket, poisoning society and endangering the weak and vulnerable. In this case, I will be exploring the US and its history, and I will try to answer the question, what does Black Lives Matter mean? The United States of America were formed in 1776 after they gained independence from Great Britain, who had ruled over their territory until then. As the British left, the US Declaration of Independence was written. To this followed a period where the United States of America were ruled by a failed government called the Articles of Confederation. This period lasted until 1788, when people tried to make the Articles of the Confederation more efficient and effective. However, after making a few drafts, they completely changed their minds and wrote the Constitution instead, which also happens to be the same piece of paper politicians argue over to this day. Of course, the people who signed the Constitution wanted to base what they wrote off of the US Declaration of Independence, one of which points stated, "All men are created equal." How lovely. Well, it would be lovely if the first president of the United States, George Washington, who also happened to be one of the signatories of the US Constitution, didn't own himself 317 slaves. Yep, you see the issue here, it's pretty clear. People weren't equal. And what's even more dramatic is that many laws still present to this day in the Constitution determined, for example, what number of other peoples, which was a kind way of saying slaves, counted as actual population and not only property, and how escaping slaves couldn't be free and, if found, had to be returned to their owners, just like objects. Yet people continued believing that every man is created equal for many, many years, 77 to be exact, until when in 1865 Lincoln, President Lincoln, led the Union to victory against the pro-slavery Confederacy, with the end of the American Civil War. This was great news. Slavery was abolished, but listen to what our dear President Lincoln had to say. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." You see the issue here? He didn't care. People weren't equal. In fact, what Lincoln is trying to say here is, I abolished slavery because I want to be president and my ego prevents me from giving up my important position and give up my public image. What a nice guy, right? No, not really. But who cares? Slavery is abolished now. We are all equal, right? Unlikely it's another no. Even though slavery was abolished and the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, which, according to the History.com website, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the law. 3 years prior to that, the Jim Crow laws were created. These laws enforced racial segregation and were valid even despite the 13th and the 14th Amendment and even the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Yes, this is extremely deceptive and very, very contradictory. But how do we get from here to the Black Lives Matter movement? Well, let's fast forward to 1965, when the Jim Crow laws were finally abolished. Racial segregation was no more, but removing a feature that is so deeply embedded in American society through the simple abolition of some infamous laws is like trying to make a man single-handedly eradicate a 3,000-year-old sequoia tree. it's difficult. And just because a law is removed doesn't prevent people from changing their minds. And not to point fingers, but generally people who come from the states that during the American Civil War were part of the Confederacy, or who have a strong conservative belief, tend to be racist. And this is where the Black Lives Matter movement comes in. So, you get my point. Racism cannot be eradicated when it's been around for so long. And this brings us to the question, what does Black Lives Matter mean? Well, first and foremost, a bit of background information I think would be important. The Black Lives Matter is an organized movement that creates protests against unnecessary police brutality on black people, on black individuals. And this movement has been around for quite a bit actually, and it started officially in 2013, but didn't entirely take off until 1 year later in 2014. Now, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement does not mean that other lives do not matter. In fact, all lives matter, but in this case right here, people of color, the lives of colored people matter the most, because they are the people who have endured racism for centuries. And George Floyd's murder this year was the droplet that made the glass spill. And I see where all these people are coming from. It's good to protest. It's good to want to be listened to, because it's a cry for help. However, I don't completely agree with some of the protest methods. And people, in some cases, are taking advantage of the dramatic situation to be violent and even kill. There are truly gruesome videos of how protesters in Mexico led to the killing of several police officers. There is this video that shows about how 5 dead police officers were lying in a bath of blood, quite literally. This is not right. This is not right at all. And also, in Great Britain, Winston Churchill's statue was vandalized, as people wrote on it, he was racist. This claim, though true, does not justify the act of vandalizing the statue of the British Prime Minister who, during World War II, managed to keep a nation strong even when German Mobber aircraft were unloading tons upon tons of bombs over cities, destroying them and killing hundreds upon hundreds of civilians. Also, the Black Lives Matter protesters vandalized a memorial to the 54th Union Regiment that fought during the American Civil War without even knowing that the 54th Union Regiment they were vandalizing was a memorial to a regiment made up mostly by people of color, by black people. Also, I don't like how monuments to those who died in a war were vandalized. That's just disrespectful towards people who were conscripted in fighting and who died whilst fighting a war they probably didn't even have that much interest in anyway. Something good, though, that I really do appreciate is when in Bristol, a few weeks back, the statue of a slave trader named Edward Colston was taken down and thrown in a river. This is what protesting is, not vandalizing a memorial and the statue of a person who quite literally saved Great Britain from the Nazis. Of course, they are just trying to make themselves be heard. But sometimes, like in every protest, in every revolution, in every riot, there will be people taking advantage of the slogan, like the Black Lives Matter in this case, to loot shops, to kill people, to take revenge on some people, and to destroy buildings, destroy cars, destroy streets. And this destruction, unluckily, many times is the cause of the failure of many local businesses, local white businesses, black businesses, Caucasian businesses, Asian businesses, that other than destroying the American local economy also ruins the American society. Therefore, is Black Lives Matter only a slogan? No, not really. Black Lives Matter is a sentiment, but just like any other protest that's happening because of a feeling, because of a belief in something, there will be people taking advantage of it. Just like in the protests last year in 2019, carried out by the Gilets jaunes. Now, though, I would very quickly like to discuss one of the options that people have thought about in order to solve this problem that has been recently brought up by the Black Lives Matter protests. Some people say to defund and dismantle the police, and I think there is something inherently wrong about this claim, because even though the funds that would usually be given to the police would go towards a society, and we all know that a more educated society would eliminate racism and criminality, according to this option, in theory, the police force shouldn't be needed anymore. On paper, this makes sense, but let me give you an example, a car example. It's like having a Jaguar F-Type V8 version and a Ford GT that has a V6 engine. On paper, the Jag should be faster, but we all know that the GT40 is much, much faster, and by a lot too. And that's because there are other factors playing a role, and just having a more powerful engine won't necessarily make the car faster. There's aerodynamics, there is the weight of the car, which is impacted by other factors itself. There is the type of suspensions, the center of mass, the elevation of the car from the ground, etc., etc. People here are looking at it from only one point of view, and are daydreaming about an anarchist utopia which would never work. Why would it never work? Well, simply because without the police, or with less funds to the police, even though people should know better due to the investment of money taken away from law enforcement towards society, there still will be people committing crimes and injustices. And having less law enforcement in a country like the US, where you can simply buy a gun at a supermarket without even having to show an ID card, is extremely dangerous. And what with the intervention of the police would have been one death, the slower, smaller, or no intervention at all of law enforcement maybe could be 10 deaths, or even more. Of course, in case of, for example, a school shooting or a terrorist attack. And this is why I believe that instead of taking away that money from the police, more money should be invested in law enforcement to ensure everyone is able to do the job. Everyone is properly trained and conscious of the fact that they represent a piece of paper signed centuries ago, which is the Constitution, that dictates all the rules and subsequent laws of the country people live in. Make the paychecks higher, and make being a police officer not only another job, but a prestigious job. This has worked in Finland, where education went from the lowest figures in Europe to the highest, not in Europe, but in the world. And this worked simply by making teaching a prestigious job. And even though getting rid of the police and having a better educated society where people aren't taught to be racist seems a positive perspective, it simply cannot work, as criminality exists since before racism was a thing. So without taking away those funds from society, give more money to law enforcement would help a better police force to be created, and would help for a better police force not to do and act like in the George Floyd case. So, to conclude, what does Black Lives Matter mean? Black Lives Matter mean that right now, black people, or people of color in a more polite way, need more help than people from any other so-called race need. They have been subject to racism, as we have seen at the beginning of this video documentary, even before the creation of the United States. And even when people got rid of some extremely racist laws, like laws for slavery and the Jim Crow laws, people still could have believed in those two things. Black Lives Matter is not only a slogan, it's a cry for help. A cry for help coming from people who need help more than anybody else. From people who need to be heard and who need a solution to their problems. A solution that can be given only by bigger institutions, by governments, by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, for example. These are just example government institutions that could help solve the racism problem in the United States. And this is why we all must work together If bigger institutions don't listen to us, we as individuals must work together to get rid of racism where we can, where we as single people can make a difference. Thank you for watching.